Thank you for being here. I'm Mike McFalls, the director of Passaquan and also a professor of art at Columbus State University. And today we're going to talk about Eddie Owens Martin and thinking of through Passaquan. And so I'm going to introduce the speakers, talk a little bit about the panel, and then give you a brief history of Passaquan. It's going to be really brief. Because we have all these panelists and we really want them to talk, and at the same time we are kind of short on time. But first I want to thank the Kohler Foundation and the John Michael Kohler Arts Center. Again, what a great conference. It's so well organized. This has been amazing. And the other thing I want to do is to kind of add on to what happened last night and thank Terry Yoho and Ruth Kohler for all what they have done and what they did for Passaquan. I think it's hard to imagine the restoration effort that took place over the last 2 years for Passaquan, and it would have never happened without their support. So we're forever grateful. The Passaquan Preservation Society, which I'm a member of, and also the Columbus State University. So thank you to them. So I'm a practicing artist. I have no background in visionary art, especially visionary art sites or in art environments. And when I took on this job for director, I think there was a bit of fear that I was having. And I kept asking people questions like, and I was asking people like Anne and Jonathan and Fred Fussell and even Karen Patterson, you know, what do you do at these sites? What do you do with them? So I was asking questions like, how do you curate a lived space? And Anne always gave me an answer. I'd ask how do you make an immersive environment that is innovative, interactive, and continually kind of reinventing itself? And really the question was, though, how do you keep a place like Passaquan fresh? How do you keep visitors engaged? How do you keep people coming back? And I think that's what led to this panel today. So what we're going to do is explain a little bit of what we're trying to do at Passaquan through the assistance of these panelists and the strategies that we have and what we're trying to attempt to do at the site. So let me introduce our panelists today, and then I'll get into a brief history of Passaquan. So I want to tell you, we decided because of the time, I'm not going to go into great detail on the individual CVs. We just don't have it. All of these distinguished panelists have remarkable careers, and we are so honored that they've expressed interest in Passaquan. So to my left is now a dear friend of mine. I sometimes call him Mr. Passaquan. He's a folklorist, our first emeritus Passaquan Preservation Society member. And he, without the, one thing I want to say is without the efforts of Fred Fussell and the members of the PPS, Passaquan would have been destroyed. It would have been gone. So for the 30 years until the Kohler restoration, the only reason Passaquan's still here is because of that group and Fred's efforts. Fred's going to discuss caring for the site prior to the restoration after Eddie's death. To the left of him is Jonathan Walls. I met Jonathan Walls about a year ago, maybe a little over a year ago. He had just started his job, and Karen Patterson was down in Columbus, Georgia. And Karen, I believe, approached him around that time to do a project in response to Passaquan with a Brazilian artist named Jay Ortoff. And we brought Jay out to Passaquan together. Then we brought Jay to the archives at Columbus State University. And then we actually drove up to Atlanta to the High Museum. And I realized that Jonathan was an incredible advocate for Passaquan and has been ever since. Jonathan is the curator of American art at the Columbus Museum. I think I forgot to mention that. And he wears a lot of hats at the museum, but he has been a great supporter and has always given me ideas for Passaquan. So to the left of him is Saya Wolfock and James Ogborn. So I'm going to admit right now, I stole Karen's idea, right? Karen said she was going to have artists respond to visionary art sites or art sites, and Pasquan being one of them. And I went back to PPS. I said, what do you all think of this? Of course, PPS was so supportive. And now we've had 5 artists at Pasquan responding to the site in different ways. To the left of Jonathan there, we have James Ogborn. He's an internationally recognized composer who has received fellowships all across the world, US, Germany, Thailand. He's an assistant professor in the Schwab School of Music at Columbus State University, and he is going to briefly discuss his opera, which was a response to Pasquan. To the left of him, you will see Saya Wolfach. Saya is a New York-based artist who uses science fiction and fantasy to reimagine the world in multiple dimensions. The one thing I'll note is Jonathan introduced me to Saya. And when Jonathan showed me the work, I think it was an email, he sent it to me, it was immediate that I understood that Saya and St. Ohm had a relationship in their world building and myth making. And it seemed very clear. So Saya has visited the site and has yet to respond, and I think she's going to talk briefly about that. Am I correct? And then to the left of Saya, we have Anne Smart Martin. Anne has been really gracious with me and really taught me a lot as an artist and now as a site director. I met Anne a little over a year ago as well. She's been generous with her ideas and thoughts on how to kind of curate Pasquan as a lived space. Anne is the Stanley Polly Chipstone Professor of Art History at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She teaches material culture, decorative art, vernacular art, and museum practices, and many more things. She runs her own program over there, and she's just been a delight to work with. So like I said, I'm going to start off and give you a little bit, because I've realized we actually talked about this just a second ago, Fred and myself. Some people don't know about Eddie Martin and Pasquan, so I'm going to go back, and I want you to understand, one of the best parts of Eddie Martin is his life story. It's a journey, and I think that perhaps James might discuss that just briefly when he's talking about the opera. But Eddie was born on July 4th, 1908. He used to tell people it was at the stroke of midnight in a small town called Marion County, Georgia. He always said he felt estranged, different from all the other God-fearing citizens. In 1922, at the age of 14, Eddie hitchhiked to New York City. He spent the first dozen years in New York as a midnight cowboy street hustler, running an illicit gambling parlor, dealing marijuana, working as a waiter in a gay nightclub, and finally establishing himself as a fortune teller on 42nd Street. So in these pictures, you'll see Eddie in 1928 on the left. That's Eddie dressed in drag. He had another persona called the Tattoo Contessa. So that's his drag name. So in 1926, there's Eddie. That's actually in Pontiac, Michigan, right there. On the top there, in 1945, this is when he becomes St. Ohm. He's doing a Pasquanian dance on the top of a building in New York City. And then there in 1975 is St. Ohm at Pasquan. So in 1935, Eddie's life changed dramatically, according to Eddie. Eddie grew ill. He was ill with fever, and this is when he had his first vision. During the worst night of the illness, he thought he was going to die. He said his spirit left his body, and he encountered a vision of a great man sitting. He said with his arms, he said this man was about 8 feet tall and had arms about the size of watermelon. The being said, you need to follow my spirit, then you can go. But if you can't follow my spirit, this is the end of the road for you. From that day forward, he continued to have visions, and St. Ohm was born. In 1957, Eddie returned to Georgia and moved into his recently deceased mother's house. So this is a picture, and this is an early drawing from the archives at Columbus State University. And I imagine that one on the left there is probably the vision of the Pasquan that maybe came to him. So In 1957, like I said, he returns to Georgia and he moved to his recently deceased mother's small farmhouse. In this picture, if you look, I guess I don't have a pointer here. It's the little yellow house in the front there of the large structure on your right. He worked on the site for roughly 30 years. For time reasons, I'm not going to go into great detail about Passaquoyanism or Passaquan. But there's a quote by the author Tom Patterson, and he said, and I think this is the best description to describe Passaquan for people, and in fact, I use this a lot when people say to me, well, you got one sentence, tell me, what is Passaquan? And he said, it's kind of a mock pre-Columbian psychedelic wonderland. It's a 7-acre art environment that consists of 6 major structures, more than 900 feet of painted masonry fences, walls, painted totems, decorative walkways, sculptures, hammered steel forms, with ornamental temples and pagodas. He built his own world with his own gods, all influenced by many ancient cultures and religions from all around the world. It's kind of a pastiche of sorts. For St. Owen, Passaquan is a world where all religions, all races, all sexes live in harmony. It's his own utopia, and it's ironic that it ended up in the Deep South in Georgia in 1957. So what I'm going to do is take you through some images of Passaquan real quickly to give you a sense. But yesterday, it's become really clear that you really can't understand these sites unless you ever visit them. But when you pull up to Passaquan, this is what you see. There was somebody from Intuit that came for a tour that pointed out to me that's Eddie, and I never knew it. And then I looked at it, they're right. That's Eddie with one of his hats on, watching over Passaquan, and this is one of the last structures he built out there. Right here is the gate and entrance to Passaquan with these totem forms, Passaquoyans on the left and right flanking it. Right here is the ceremonial sandpit. So many important things happen at the sandpit that we can't go into great detail yet. But I know that James might talk about it briefly because we're going to hold the first opera of Passaquan in this sandpit and in the well house there. This is the inside of the pagoda well house that was behind the sandpit here, that structure. It's on the second story of that structure. This is the largest temple at Passaquan, and inside of that is this vestibule. And these are the walls of Passaquan with the Passaquoyans. And here's I just picked 2 of the many, many totems out at Passaquan. I just picked 2 of my favorite to kind of give you a sense of the individual Passaquoyans on the site. And I also wanted to give credit to Parma Conservation and International Artifacts here. I mean, I cannot express how amazing this restoration process was. So this is a before and after of my favorite part of Passaquan, the most beautiful propane shed of all of Georgia, maybe all of the Southeast. And when you look at this, you'll notice how well it's how well the restoration process was. So it's amazing. And here are some of our student interns that worked with that group. I'm not going to get into detail, but one thing I will say with Columbus State University is our president said to me when he came in, he said, you have to make Passaquan connect to the curriculum, connect to the educational mission of the university. And that's been my challenge from the start. And at this point, we have universities from all over the region coming and studying there. We have research and scholarship happening at Passaquan, and we've had over 200 students from Columbus State alone, not including the other universities in the region, that have worked at that site in some capacity. And this is an example of student work at the site. And then all I wanted to show you, this is our caretaker, because I promised I'd put him on there, and you've seen him around. This is Charles Fowler, our caretaker at one of our events, playing in the sandpit. I can't do it without Charles. It's your turn, Fred.
Well, as Mike said, Eddie left New York City when he was in the mid 1950s. He had been there since he was in his teens, really, and came home and began to work pretty diligently on building Passaquan. And he did a lot of work himself, although he did hire local people who had skills to assist him with the work. And actually, as I understand it, he paid better than most of the other local people who employed folks to do work. So he was able to get the very best people in the community to do work with him. In 1975, there was an exhibit at the Columbus Museum. Well, actually, it was about 1977 to 78 at the Columbus Museum of Eddie's work. Probably just six or seven paintings, and as far as I know, that's the only one-person exhibition that he ever had in a museum during his lifetime. The museum was very young at the time. It was in a house. It was a house museum, basically. So we have a photograph that is possibly from that exhibit, and the paintings are hung on pegboard, which sounds right to me for the early days of the museum. In 1975, there was an exhibition put together by the Georgia State Council on the Arts and Humanities. It was a bicentennial project, American bicentennial, called Missing Pieces, Georgia Folk Art. And Eddie was represented in that exhibit, which was kind of the first major exhibition in which he was featured. That exhibit opened at the Atlanta Historical History Center, went to the Telfair Academy in Savannah, to the Columbus Museum, and then its final venue was at the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C. And for that occasion, St. Ohm, other featured artists like Howard Finster, Laura Pope, Ulysses Davis, were flown up to Washington to be a part of the opening, and there are good stories about that trip, believe me, as our president would say. In 75, one of the things that happened that was really important later on was the Buena Vista Garden Club, the Beautiful View Garden Club, and in collaboration with the Marion County Historical Society, sponsored a tour of homes. So among the homes featured, like maybe half dozen or so, antebellum and Victorian big houses in Buena Vista, they included Passaquan. And Eddie was just so thrilled about that. He had always been a great member of the community, he always was, but he was really pleased to have been included in that tour of homes. 1981, St. Ohm was featured in a book and an exhibition which I curated at the Columbus Museum called In Celebration of a Legacy, The Traditional Arts of the Chattahoochee Valley of Alabama and Georgia. And that was a pretty major exhibition. Went to a couple of other venues in the region, but there was a lot of associated programming in which St. Ohm was able to participate and show his regalia, as Charles does now. He died. He died in 1986 in April by his own hand. And a local attorney, Wayne Jernigan, was appointed the executive of the state. And to our surprise, and to a lot of surprises, he had written a will, a very detailed will. And in it, Passaquan was bequeathed to the Marion County Historical Society. as a result of that tour of homes that had happened. Well, the people in the Marion County Historical Society were surprised, to say the least. The Marion County Historical Society had never been formalized as an organization. It didn't have any kind of legal status. It was just a loose-knit group of mostly women in the community, including my mother-in-law. And so they said, no, we can't deal with this. So the executor then offered the site and the collection of art to the Columbus Museum. And the Columbus Museum was just then beginning to instigate a major fund drive to build a new building for the whole facility. So they declined the offer. And it fell back to the Marion County Historical Society. They, as quickly as they possibly could, got themselves organized, gained a 501c3 status, and prepared to accept the responsibility for the maintenance and preservation of Passaquan. There's St. Ohm. This is a photograph of possibly his only exhibition, one-person exhibition. And this is pretty early. I can tell he's a fairly young guy, and his regalia there is not quite as elaborate as it became later on. Well, another surprise, Eddie left money behind. He had a bank account, a non-interest drawing checking account with a little over $40,000 in it. His assistant, Scotty Stewart, who had worked with Eddie as a kind of a nursemaid for a number of years before his death, dug up a map canister, a military map canister off somewhere on the grounds that had another $40,000 in cash. And then in going through all the materials that were left after his death, I was going through a stack of fabric and clothing, and I found another $3,500 in a paper sack. So there was all this cash and money around that nobody really had realized that he had accrued over the years. And in addition to paying for all the materials that it took to build Passaquan, where'd all this money come from? That's still a good question.
We talk about that a lot.
We do. There's the cover for the celebration of a legacy book, and at the time the museum was known as the Columbus Museum of Arts and Sciences. Its narratives focus a little bit since then. After Eddie's death, Tom Patterson, who wrote Eddie's biography, and Roger Manley, who's at Duke University, and I spent the better part of a week making sort of a preliminary catalog of the unattached artwork that was left behind following Eddie's death. And at the time, we listed something over 350 individual works, which were later removed to a storage area in Columbus for safekeeping. This is a cover of Tom Patterson's book, which was published in 1987, a biography of Eddie based on interviews, extended interviews that Tom had with Eddie, and the book is written in Eddie's words. Tom recently gave me the tapes, which will later go to Columbus State University archives. But before that happens, I want to listen to some of those tapes and see if Tom was really sticking to the 1988, North Carolina Conservator Mark Kingsley did kind of a preliminary condition report on the buildings and the other structures at Passaquan. And it took until 1990 for the estate to be settled and the ownership of the property to be transferred legally to the Marion County Historical Society. And by then, the executor and other things had caused most of the cash to disappear. So there wasn't very much left of that cache of cash that Eddie had left behind. In the 1990s, the Marion County Historical Society, at my suggestion, offered works to museums around the country. And so works by St. Owens were placed in a number of American museums. Some museums accepted our offer and some didn't. But among the museums that did were the National Museum of American Art, the LA County Museum, the New Orleans Museum of Art, the Albany, Georgia Museum of Art, the Hunter Museum of Art in Chattanooga, and there were a couple of others in the region that took work. Then we had to worry about maintenance and keeping the place going and keep it from falling apart. So I wrote a series of proposals, grant proposals, for really very specific purposes, ordinarily to keep things from falling apart. So we were able to get funding from the National Endowment for the Arts, $35,000, from the Knight Foundation for $30,000, from the Mildred Miller Ford Foundation, which is a Columbus foundation, for $7,500, and then the Flint Electric Cooperative, which is the local power company, began then and has almost annually given money to the preservation of the place from that time until the Kohler Foundation took over. With that money, we were able to put a perimeter fence around the place, to put in climate control in the main building for the first time, and to install a security system. We had some problem with vandalism and theft, but interestingly enough, the thieves who broke in or came onto the property took things that could be easily sold on the street or pawned, and they never really stole any artwork, which is kind of interesting to me. 1992, the Marion County Historical Society decided they really weren't set up to do Passaquan. They were interested in Victorian houses and in preserving landmarks in the county that were of more of a historical nature from their point of view. So in 1992, a group of us sort of broke off from that, or actually it was a lot of the same people, formed the Passaquan Preservation Society, and it received its 501c3 status as a nonprofit organization. 1993, also, the Passaquan was documented as part of the Smithsonian's Inventory of American Painting and Sculpture Project. 1998, Conservator Tony Rager conducted a conservation survey of Passaquan's buildings and a limited survey of the associated loose works of art. 1998, a topographical survey of the property was conducted pro bono by Southern Research, which is a regional archaeological contractor, and that was the first time we ever had a really good map and measured drawings of the buildings and of the other structures on the property. And then in 2000, a preliminary and pretty detailed site conservation plan was developed by David Cavender and Associates, which is an engineering and architectural firm from Atlanta. And that they came with a budget with a step-by-step process, which they estimated would cost about $1.5 million, which we obviously didn't have. It was not until 2003 that, 7 years after St. Owens' death, that the ownership of the property was legally passed from Marion County Historical Society to the Passaquan Preservation Society. And interestingly enough, it was in 2003 that I first wrote a letter to Terry Yoho. I had heard from a number of sources that might be our salvation, so I wrote that letter. And Terry quickly responded, explaining that Kohler's plate was full and that they couldn't give us any assistance. In 2006, Passaquan was named to a list called Georgia's 10 Top Places in Peril, and that gave us a lot of statewide publicity that we hadn't had before. 2007, under the leadership of Dr. John Loophole, who's a professor of history at Columbus State University, we were able to fill out the documentation and get Passaquan listed on the National Register of Historic Places. That was a great PR move. It would sort of legitimize the place in the minds of people who didn't have any understanding otherwise of the significance of an eccentric art site. And, well, I'm going to give you a second to kind of look at some of this text. This was an early effort to kind of organize things by Jonathan Williams, who was the publisher of the St. Owen book through the Jargon Press. Jonathan was the guy who he was really a supporter of Passaquan from the earliest times, knew Eddie well, and he came up with a statement that has been my answer to many people's questions: is, was he religious? And Jonathan Williams says, when Eddie got religion, he got them all. That's the purpose of the Passaquan Preservation Society, which it served us well until we were in a position to pass it along. My initial letter to Terry Yoho. In the meantime, we did public programming. We had an annual event called Artists for Passaquan, in which we would invite artists to come there, exhibit their work, just as a gesture of support by other artists for the preservation of the place. And that worked well for years. We did rack cards. These were put in all the state welcome centers. So we were open on one weekend a month, I think, for public tours. And then finally, in 2013, I wrote another letter to Terry Yoho. And this time, she said she was ready to talk about it. So St. Owen and I celebrated when that happened. And that's where we met Kohler. Thank you.
I just wanted to give a shout out to all the unsung heroes, like the custodians and the caterers and all the admin folks running interference. I know how much work it is. I can't say enough good things about Karen Patterson and her vision, and one is that I wanted to focus on is that turquoise plus symbol that you see everywhere throughout the year in terms of the larger project. And to me, that's not just a plus symbol, but also sort of this intersection of the upward realm and the horizontal realm, but also we saw it yesterday in the African cosmography. And I just think the further I get in my career, that I'm realizing more and more that knowledge is really something that's produced collaboratively. So I'm really grateful that Karen invited me to be part of this amazing project. Very briefly, I sort of tentatively asked Karen if I could invite yet another corresponder to work with me, and she, like St. Gnome, flung her arms open and said, let's do it. And so an artist I had been really wanting to work with for a long time came to visit the site, as Michael indicated. He went back to the studio in Brazil, worked feverishly for about 2 months, came back for a week in January, and we put up this project in literally 5 days, I guess. Very intense, and I think it really speaks highly of Jay Orthoff, not just his amazing sort of creative vision, but also how passionate and determined and how much hard work he put into this. He literally showed up at the airport with work already made so that when we started the installation, we could just keep moving forward. We quickly realized, Jay and I, that like recreating Passaquan at Kohler was going to be impossible for so many reasons, and so we decided that creating some kind of correspondence or some kind of presentation that would evoke the spirit of Passaquan was what we wanted to do. Karen was very eager for us to use the recently acquired Passaquan objects like the sculpture and mandala in the background, and we happily agreed. My penultimate comment will be that when these kinds of projects happen, and working with folks like James and Saya, there's always the unexpected, the unknown, the kind of space for synchronicity to happen. And when Karen and I went to pick up Jay at the hotel on the Friday of the installation, it was the last day. We had so much work to get done, and we were freaking out that we weren't going to be able to do it. And Jay got into the car and immediately just burst into tears. And Karen and I were so concerned, and we asked him, what's happening, what's wrong? And he said that his best friend had died the night before, and he had just found out. And so it was really this amazing experience where Jay was able to use the entire installation to sort of grieve and work through that process. And I just can't explain how mysterious and sort of spiritual that was to have those events happen and be a part of it. So I will stop and pass the baton to James.
Hello. So I'm just going to say a few things, and then I'm going to let music speak for me, although I apologize in advance because it is not real instruments. It will be MIDI, which if you don't know what that means, you'll get a sense of things. So basically, you know, when tasked with this project, when Mike and I first talked about this, one of the first decisions was kind of about what story to tell, because opera is, you know, it's a narrative flow. It's obviously we can't pack an entire lifetime into, you know, the run of the opera. So which parts of the story do we tell? What do I focus on, and what do I work with the librettist on from the outset? And essentially, what we decided was that we were going to tell the story, everything that we could up to the point that he returns to Georgia, because that seemed like the interesting narrative for an opera. I don't think, you know, watching an opera of 2 hours or whatever it would be of somebody chipping at rocks and painting rocks would be all that interesting. So, but the parts of New York where he's in drag and, you know, hustling and all that kind of stuff sounded a lot more intriguing to me. So that was sort of the first decision. And then I started to think carefully about what his life would be, and some of this came into the libretto, but some of it was musical decisions that I made. We talked a little bit about this journey as an odyssey, like an Odysseus-style odyssey, where you go out and you come back. That story of, you know, hero goes on a quest, but usually they come back, and that is the story of Eddie. So I built into the musical narrative a lot of things, with things coming back in certain ways, and tried to carefully sort of place things as memories and also things as actual acts within within the narrative. And then finally, you know, the other part of the story that was very interesting to me that I was having trouble dealing with was this idea of the cultural pastiche, because that can be a really uncomfortable place to go to. As an artist, I think probably many of you would agree with me. And so I had to find a way to incorporate some of this eclecticism into, by the way, that's who I am, into the story. And so eventually what I decided was that it wouldn't be cultural in my own approach. It would be more trying to find as many different parts of my voice, distinct parts of my voice, and bring them together into one work. So this is the scene. Most of the entire opera basically will take place on this sand pit, which is going to be a really interesting place. The orchestra will be behind the sand pit up against the wall where you can see there. If you can come down October 13 and 14, please do. I'd love to see anybody and everybody there. Also, I just want to say that it's been really great to be here for this conference, because usually I'm basically 100% of my life, because I'm also married to an oboist, I spend surrounded by musicians, and so it's nice to talk about something else. But I think I'm just going to leave you with a little taste of what the music sounds like. This is the ensemble meeting, and I have a little MIDI file, so bear with me for the quality. So that was just thank you. So that was just a little taste of the cyclic part, one of the cyclic parts of the work, which is that's the overture, and you're going to hear that many times in the course of the piece, or remnants of it, which really is associated most strongly with the visions, which are kind of the end point, the end goal of the narrative. So, as I said, please come join me. Come join us out at Passaquan. Charles will be there. So that I think that will help. So, yeah, thank you.
Hi, I'm Saya Wolfalk. I am a visual artist. Do I point this way? Yeah, okay. And I'm basically just going to talk a little bit about my work, and I think it'll be pretty apparent why it makes a lot of sense for me to kind of work in the legacy of Eddie Martin. So I graduated from the School of the Art Institute of Chicago in 2002, and I actually studied with Jim Zanzi while I was there. So the kind of Lisa Stone, Jim Zanzi connection that's here is it kind of, when I saw Jim here, I was like, wow, you're here. This makes so much sense. I'm back. Hi. And so basically when I graduated, I lived in northeastern Brazil for 2 years. I had a Fulbright to study folkloric performance traditions in northeastern Brazil. And from that emerged a really kind of epic multi-part narrative project that I've been working on since 2006. So the people that I've been kind of constructing in this fiction are called the Noplacians. And the Noplacians are part plant and part human, and change gender and color, and turn back into the landscape when they die. I invited people into my studio to tell me their ideas of utopia. And from their ideas of utopia came a narrative script and an ethnography of this fictional world. So I worked with an anthropologist for about 2 years, from 2006 to 2008, to document this fictional future world of plant humans. These are the ancestors of the Noplacians exchanging symbolic language with the Noplacians. And the installation has traveled to many museums throughout the United States, Canada, and many parts of Asia in this form. So from that project, which was a fictional future world, emerged a desire to think about how people in the present could actually become the plant humans of this future. I collaborated with biologists at Tufts University to think through what kinds of mutations could happen for us to become the plant humans of No Place. The empathics, this is a culture that emerges out of this investigation, lend an exhibition of their material culture to the Montclair Art Museum. So as you go to this exhibition, there are didactics that tell the story of the empathics from the perspective of the empathics. This is the first diorama you would have seen. It's called Herniated Consciousness. So the first physical manifestation of becoming an empathic is to develop a second head. So they also create visionary paintings through something called utopia conjuring therapy. This is one of their visionary paintings, and they're collected in a book called Empathetic Plant Alchemy. Once they go through utopia conjuring therapy, they shed their second heads and develop petal-covered wings. They sell their sheds, their hides, and their skins to perpetuate the research of their institute. So they have a nonprofit research institute called the Institute of Empathy. We staged performances in the installation, and this project has also traveled pretty extensively throughout the United States. So from the Institute of Empathy, I started thinking about what happens when utopian visions of collective imagining actually get incorporated into corporatized logics. The empathics establish Chimatech, a corporation that allows for human beings to transcend their physical limits and erase their identities so they may download customized virtual avatars. This is a user using the Avatar Download Station. And there's a whole kind of narrative video series. So you're seeing kind of little tiny snippets. There's video, there's immersive installation, there's performance, and all of the different elements of the story are distributed through a variety of different media. This is an installation called Virtual Chimeric Space, which is now in the permanent collection of the Seattle Art Museum, which is really exciting. And basically, it is a cloud conjuring technology that the empathics construct so that they can actually make contact with this virtual world called the Kaima Cloud. The Kaima Cloud was also presented in Times Square as a series of immersive videos. So not only are their dreams actually being made present within the context of museum environments, but they're also being presented in kind of these dream-making spaces of New York City. Simultaneously, I collaborated with a former dancer of the Alvin Ailey Dance Company to choreograph a piece in Fulton Center where dancers conjured elements of the cloud into Fulton Center in Manhattan. The dancers used iPads to show these virtual crystals that were downloaded from the Kaima Cloud. If you were actually present for the performance, you could download the application, it's called Refract, onto your smartphone, and you could see the virtual crystal appear on your phone as the dancers performed. My most recent installation is currently on view at Amherst College at the Mead Art Museum. And I included images of this because this is kind of the starting point for me for thinking about my project with Pasaquan. The first thing that I generally do when I work site-specifically with an organization or a place is I imagine a character. And so that's basically what I plan on doing with Eddie and his story. I plan on constructing a visionary, a fictional visionary, who creates architecture that allows us access to a place called the Figment Constellation. And then the Figment Constellation will be fleshed out in a series of virtual reality experiences that I do as a collaboration with Google. Thank you.
I can imagine how you doing that.
It's pretty hard to follow up on that kind of creativity and artistry. First of all, I wanted to thank Karen Patterson for putting such a fabulous, fabulous conference together, and I've learned a lot and got some new ideas as well. Secondly, I want to thank Terry Yoho, who has been marvelous to me. We've had a number of grand adventures where we go together to some important sites that Kohler is conserving, and for that I'm deeply grateful. The third thing I wanted to say is to thank all these people sitting here who gave me entree to Pasaquan while I was under conservation, me and my students, so that I have had a chance to walk around, enjoy, and think about these things a lot. My story is that I teach material culture at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and that one of the things I look at is the history of environments, history of houses, history of art. I teach vernacular art. I teach what I call arts of the edge, which is everything that has to be hyphenated before or qualified. And that these ways I kind of try to blend these ideas of material culture, architectural history, spaces and places, and these ideas of vernacular art as well. So I love the fact that Fred told us something in his talk I didn't really know, but that he was really pleased that Eddie was really pleased to be added into the Buena Vista Garden Club, that he was thrilled, because I'm kind of asking you to think about that. So throughout my work, I've been trying to think of a way to position these art environments in a new way, and to think about the way in which we've heard many people comment, how can we think about these, besides these are eccentric people that are creative and passionate, and how do we think about them differently? What if we thought of these extraordinary art environments as a domestic environment, a house, a home, surrounded by art? So my talk today is meant to give us some different things to think about: their artistic wizardry, their passionate creativity, their quest for spiritual places. But what about a home? So architectural historians and material culture specialists all look at houses as places and spaces. They look at structures, materials, building practices, the physical environs, and they look to see how they can create and follow cultural paradigms. So we can think about house or home as a place where fits into an idea of cultural pride, what a house should be, but also individuals who work within that idea. So looking at some of the literature about home theory, what a house is meant to be. It's something structured and bound, but how does an individual fit in or triangulate within that? Just some ideas. They talk about boundaries, walls, thresholds, and doors, and both inside and outside, about spaces with entries and exits that pierce the containment. We talked about it could be a front stage and a backstage, like a living room, like the living room you never sit in versus the cozy den, the dining room versus the kitchen with smells and dirt, and you can even see in greater attention to architectural detail. The third is where they talk about public and private, that home could be a sanctuary from work that was considered unclean, dirty versus private and pure. A third way is homes in transition or homes in danger, so that the homes themselves can change and the people can change that in the environment as well. When we think about that in terms today, we're thinking about development and problems with curation too. These are houses and homes in danger. And finally, we can think about homes and changing perceptions. And I love to think about the man cave now and where that came from as a way to think about how different traditions evolve and go through. So, and the final point is that ideals and reality don't mesh, of course. I've done some work on modern architecture, and we know now that the 1950s homes that are so modern on the outside are not at all on the inside, that people don't really want to sit on chrome furniture. So the final point is to think about how there is a kind of deviation from that idea of assembled environment. And some of these are quite spiritual places. These ideas that maybe they're religious, but that it could develop within that. And in these, we come to the question of any so-called unorthodox ideas of art. So enter Passaquan and Eddie St. Omer Martin. We didn't hear about this today, but he had a horrific childhood of poverty and brutality. He left at a young age to travel the country, spent a long period of time in New York City. But it's interesting that even as he writes about that, he talks about his homes. He stresses, here this was a place that had 2 bedrooms, or here was a place that he had no place to stay. So he was very conscious in his remembering about those places and spaces. So that we think, and he also would say no place to sleep. So then he continues to come home to bring in the crops to help his mom, and she has an 1890s house. So let me see if I can get going on this. Here we are. And just want to shout, these are some of the adventures I had with Terry Yoho and my students at Passaquan. So I was able to be there during the conservation process, so I must say I haven't seen it in its final glory. Oh my goodness, what a difference. What a difference. He continues to come home. He comes back and he goes to his mother's house, which is 1890s. And we start thinking about, he continued his wish to create a mystical environment. And he explained that, quote, I build this place to have something to identify with, because there's nothing I see in the society that I identify with or desire to emulate. Another time he wrote that he redid his environment so he could feel comfortable. So let's look at the site plan for just a minute, because I wanted you to think about what the house was and what it became. So we see that we have kind of a traditional saddleback structure here, and associated 3 smaller spaces behind. This was originally the front porch, which was filled in. You can see he also added all these materials in other ways, and here's, of course, the art in the yard, so to say, and then the other structures around. But you can see that their changes are being made. They don't change the walls, but he does add on and add to. And he did also decorate. He also made these places as a way to connect from or connect to. So I started to think about the house. And the most obvious thing, right, was there's no spatial dimensions because it's unmarked. We don't know anything about it. But the outside, as we saw in those great slides, the house was decorated inside. He painted furniture and walls. He created a Passaquanian habitat. Was it a private space, public space? Well, you can think about people traipsing in for readings, the public, to this otherworldly environment, no doubt saw the house as an extension of his art. It's a place, or it's a place also to put your wishes in glass bowls and to create this idea. It was neither house nor art environment. He said as much when he reminisced at age 77 that he would like to retire, because going back and forth from my work out there on my beautiful temples into that front room with them people, that gets mighty old after a while. So is this house part of his grand vision, his grand artistic vision? Was it a way to attract more paying customers? Did he have a conceptual front space, back space? Was it private? Was it public? And was the front room the only place that the public ventured? So I don't have answers to these. I wanted to shout out to Fred that we talked last night, and turns out that he received a lot of his visitors in the kitchen, so that you have this other sort of space that's a little bit of both. So what is private public? What is front stage, backstage? And how did Eddie deviate from the social standards? So his visitors had to cross thresholds that were fairly standard and step into a room with fairly standard dimensions. So I started thinking about, in other of these art environments, I've been thinking about the art as well as the life lived. So one of the things I've done is sort of go through some of the places that I've been with Terry and worked at. The Garden of Eden, which was a lived spot, and we can think about that as public and private, and that it was an attraction. It was a way to get people to come to the place, and there's Terry there on the bottom, and that it was public and private on top. But you can see that he really saw that as an attraction, as a way to get people to notice this place, and this place that was glowing with electricity and light for people to notice with this new excitement of that. We can also think about Mary Knoll's property. And again, this was before the fantastic final restoration that's going on. And she also was one. But we need to think about her as something different when we think about her art environment and her home. She was trained at the Art Institute. She inherited this house from her parents, and she tried to start a business in a semi-commercial place. She inherited her parents' beach house, and she began a total transformation. She's very organized, very methodical, list of projects, writing, relax, I'll enjoy more putting all in order. So she reconfigured and ornamented every surface. Here's the outside, which we saw earlier. Here's some of the interior shots as well. So all these transformations were occurring, but she's a trained artist, and we need to think about that. I learned more this weekend about the Rhinestone Cowboy and how he ornamented his private home only after he got ill and was not able to be out and around. So he decorated his home, he ornamented the interior of his house so that he could bring people in. So these are just suggestions for different directions. And I heard a lot of pleas yesterday about how to think about these people as something beyond sort of crazy, eccentric, what have you, in terms of their artistry. So how do we place these people? All these artists are incredible and deserve full due and acclaim as a creative, passionate people. But if I put on my museum hat, I also think, well, what is this about a place that's lived and that creative, passionate people who worked also within the art environment? So I would suggest that another way to engage visitors is to get them to think about their own lives in the context of these other art environments and people. It's about both art and life. And it's not merely biographical, because if we do that, we can't really compare and contrast different situations. And that, again, this idea of oddities. So we can think about placing Eddie in a continuum of creativity and material expression as a person who had to live somewhere. That's one way to connect to visitors in their life. So to wrap up, Mike and I have been talking quite a bit about other creative ways to keep Passaquan active and alive. And one of the ideas we had was to kind of create a consortia that, as you've seen, Kohler has a number of sites with partnerships to universities, thinking about the Painted Forest, Chauvin, and also Passaquan. What if we had a boot camp where we had students come and spend several weeks learning about outsider art or our environments, and then actually get to be on site and living on site and getting that experience. Maybe they're camping. And that way we can start getting this information out to a new generation of students and scholars. But that would be very hot, but we could maybe do it some other time. But the point being, yeah, at the time. But the point being is another way to sort of re-energize some of these spaces and have this rotating time. You can go to different spaces and different places and different times. So just one more way to think about other ways to freshen up with the visitors and with scholars and academics. So thank you.
So of course we went over, but we'll sit around and take a question or two if we're allowed. Are we allowed, or are we rushed for time? Oh, we have about 5 minutes. So. Okay. You might have to get closer.
Can you turn on my mic? I just, this was actually the last comment I wanted to make, and I got distracted by passing the baton to James. But based on my previous museum experience, I had a grad school year at the O'Keeffe Museum in Santa Fe, and I think one way to think about animating these kind of artist environments, one might look to single artist museums, because they constantly have to think about, how can I make Georgia O'Keeffe and her work interesting when people think that they know it? So I think what I would throw out to the visitors here is to look at what single artist museums are doing, and maybe translating that into an artist environment site.
That's a good point. So do we have any questions?
Okay. I'm Kerr McVeigh. I'm a writer from New York. It's kind of a two-part question, and it deals with two potentially problematic talking points, which I think were sort of broached. The first, the sandbox, to me looked like some sort of ceremonial space with air quotes. And Michael, I felt like you deftly dodged programming that doesn't necessarily have to do with music. So I want to know, looking at Eddie and not being totally familiar with him, he clearly has a sort of psychedelic history. I think he used it in that defining sentence. So how does one contextualize that, number one, his potentially psychedelic history? And then number two, when it comes to identity politics and this larger idea of cultural appropriation, the Native American headdresses, et cetera, how does one also contextualize the problematic nature of this man who is sort of bleeding authenticity with this larger problematic nature of cultural appropriation?
I think this question of cultural appropriation is a good question, and terrified me when I first started looking at Eddie Martin and Passaquan. But I began to think about it because, number one, I think Eddie, he wasn't exposed to the understanding of these cultures. He usually would learn them. Well, actually, he's self-taught. Let's put it that way. So, and he's very interested in all these cultures. And the more I got to understand Eddie and Pasquan, and Fred might be able to speak about this too, is I think Eddie thinks he's celebrating all these cultures. He's not stealing them. He's embracing them, and this is a celebration of all of these cultures. And he talks about that a lot in the Tom Patterson book. But you also have to put him in context of time. I mean, his first vision's 1935. He's 1957. He starts building these places, and cultural appropriation was not part of that kind of dialogue, and definitely wasn't in South Georgia, rural South Georgia. So that's some way I explain it when that question comes up, because I found that terrifying. It looks like James might have to comment on that.
I mean, not as much about that, but can I understand your question about the sandbox? Can you clarify what you're asking there? That maybe music isn't, that's not the place for music because it's meant for rituals that we. Oh, okay.
No.
So I misunderstood that.
Well, with the cultural appropriation, I'm certainly not criticizing this gentleman who
Oh, yeah, yeah.
exists within a time bubble, but obviously part of this is sort of how do we contextualize
do
the
that, yeah.
ongoing legacy of these individuals? And when people are new to this gentleman or this space, obviously in this modern context, we're going to have to engage with these questions. So I'm certainly not judging this guy who looks awesome in every single way. Number two,
I want you to know I never thought that. I was just saying that's how
okay, cool.
I
just
I
want to
get
clarify,
that question all the time.
I would hang with Eddie any day of the week. And perhaps Sai, you can jump in too, because I think your work speaks to this too. The sandbox, and Michael, again, one of the first things I heard you say was, we'll get into it later, whatever programming is taking place within the sandbox. So to me, based on some personal experiences of my own, the sandbox to me looks much like potentially a space that would serve a function much like a Maloka in a sort of South American medicinal plant place or something like that. It also looks like a sandbox. I don't know, maybe kids like to play around, throw sand around. It could be that.
Cats.
Cats. So is it appropriate for music? Is it appropriate for your music? Of course. Is it appropriate for anything that could potentially take place within that space? Of course. But what I'm saying is, based on the larger aesthetic and the information I've been accumulating, and also just sort of speculating or trying to tap into Eddie, it seems like it's a rather strategic ceremonial space.
It is. And maybe I'll let Fred talk about. Do you want to, or do you want me to talk about?
I can tell you what he did.
Yeah, that'd be good. You can find the videos.
He often paraded around in that space. He would dress in full regalia, come sort of dramatically out of that building that's adjacent to it, come down the stairs, dance around, beating a drum or strumming on this old Silvertone guitar that he had and never tuned. And once he had danced around the perimeter of that circle, he would have inscribed a scroll pattern in the sand with his feet as he went around, which was, so, all that stuff was in him and was coming out all the time on an everyday basis. So that's the way he used it, and he used it often that way, and I've seen him do it. If he had visitors, he would often dance for them, even when he was getting pretty sick, and I'd say, "Hey, man, you better calm down." But
There you go. You had it.
he loved it.
One more.
Yeah, and
So, and I think just to kind of add to that, I think this is an important space to Eddie. The way it's set up in the space, the more I'm at Passaquan, he performed in it. He was performing to to people that came to visit him at this space. And in fact, the longer I'm there, and this is my speculation, interpretation of the place, is there's many videos of Eddie standing on the top of that well house right there, standing on it, and it's a bridge, it's a stage, and he's talking down to the folks around the perimeter of that sand pit, and he comes down slowly. And actually, I often talk about those little dots on the stairs as being almost like stage lights, right? You got to remember, he's in New York. He's interested in theater. He's performing, and he uses the space as a performance space. I don't think it was necessarily always ceremonial. I think it had many applications in the day-to-day experience at Passaquan. Eddie was a character, and you got to understand that he made several personas over his life. I mean, he created several personas over his life. So I don't know if that answers your question, but it seemed to me when James came to me and said he wanted to make an opera, because I brought him out there, and I just bring artists out there and say, what do you think? And he came back to me and said, I want to make an opera. I said, perfect. And he goes, and I want to do it in the sand pit. And I said, that's exactly where Eddie would do it. I mean, that's where he performed, and that's the way I looked at it, I think. We've had weddings there, too.